My name is Michael Vandenberg, and I'm a professor of law here at Vanderbilt Law School. And with my wife and colleague Linda Bregan, I am the co-professor for the Environmental Law and Policy Annual Review class as well. And it's in that capacity that I'm here today. I want to welcome all of you on behalf of Vanderbilt Law School. We're really excited to have a remarkable mixture of people from around the campus, across the law school, throughout Middle Tennessee, and even coming in from out of state. And we think we have a very interesting program for you today. The Environmental Law and Policy Annual Review is something that was formed by a group of us about 5 years ago or so, and we select the very best environmental law articles from the 500 or so that are picked every year. I won't say more than that because our next speaker will say just a word or two about how we do that. But we formed LPAR, as we call it, for three principal reasons. And the first is why we're here today, which is to facilitate the movement of the best ideas from the academy into the policy world, to bridge from the academic theoretical work into the policy world. So that's goal number one. Goal number two is to improve the quality of the theoretical work that's out there. We cannot always assume a can opener when we need to open a can, despite the fact we'd like to do that in the academy. And so we think that the very best academic theoretical work will be done when we hold our feet to the fire by accounting for the limits and constraints that policymakers actually have to face rather than assuming them away. So that's goal number two. And the third goal, and the most important goal, is to provide the best possible educational experience for our students. And I hope that what we here are doing today is just one of several pieces of that process here, and we're really excited about how that works. As an example of that, our next speaker is Kaki Talbot, and she is the editor-in-chief of the Environmental Law and Policy Annual Review and a third-year student. So, Kaki?
Hi, my name is Kaki Talbot, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Environmental Law and Policy Annual Review. Each year, the LPAR process culminates in bringing speakers like Professor Eisen to Vanderbilt, as well as to our conference in DC coming up in April. And the process begins with LPAR students doing a global search of top environmental law reviews and law reviews in general for the word environment. Once students have looked through this pool of articles and pulled out ones that actually deal with environmental law, they review the articles and retain only those articles that have a major issue of environmental importance and a law or policy relevant proposal. After this, we redistribute the articles, and students again evaluate the articles on a scale for one of three criteria: relationship to issues of major importance to environmental quality, relevance to law or policy proposals, and persuasiveness. Students then choose the top 10 articles in their queue to present at our annual selection meeting. At the selection meeting, along with our professorial advisors, we choose the top 20 articles to send on to our advisory board. After that, we have a conference call with our advisory board, and we choose the final contenders, Professor Eisen's piece among them. So our finished work will eventually become an issue of LPAR, which we hope addresses the important environmental law and policy issues of today. I hope that we all learn together today from Professor Eisen.
Thank you, Kaki, and welcome everyone on behalf of the Environmental Law Institute. My job today is really simple. I'm just going to keep us moving along and keep us on schedule. And the only thing I want to note is we are going to take a very brief break at 5 so students who need to go to class can go to class, and we're going to have cookies and coffee in the back of the room for the rest of you to grab, and then we will reconvene right away with further panel discussion. So I am going to hand it over now to Matt to introduce our panel, and thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Matt Seidl. I'm the articles editor for Professor Eisen's article, Renewable Energy by Whom? It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Eisen and each of our panelists. Professor Joel B. Eisen is a graduate of Stanford Law School, and he received his bachelor's degree from MIT. He currently teaches at the University of Richmond School of Law. He has also been a Fulbright Professor of Law at the China University of Political Science and Law in Beijing. For 12 years, he was director of the Robert R. Merhig Jr. National Environmental Negotiation Competition and also the Merhig Summer Stipend Program. Professor Eisen is the co-author of the leading law and business school text on energy law, energy economics, and the environment, which has been adopted in over 40 energy law and policy courses. His academic interests include brownfields, electricity restructuring, global warming regulation, and laws favoring alternative energy sources. And perhaps most relevant, in his spare time, Professor Eisen has penned crossword puzzles for the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, and Wall Street Journal. Reagan Farr is the Vice Chairman and Chief Operating Officer of Silicon Ranch Corporation. Prior to co-founding Silicon Ranch, he served as Commissioner to the Tennessee Department of Revenue. Previously, he served on the Executive Committee of the Southeastern Association of Tax Administrators and the State Board of Equalization. As an integral member of Governor Bredeson's job cabinet, Farr worked closely with the Department of Economic and Community Development to recruit new investment and to support existing industry in Tennessee. He was recognized in 2009 as the Champion of Small Business by the National Coalition for Capital and as 2010 Fred H. Harris Economic Development Council Professional of the Year. He earned his law degree from the University of North Carolina and a bachelor's degree in economics from Louisiana State. Matt Kisber is the president and CEO of Silicon Ranch Corporation. Previously, he served as the commissioner of the Tennessee Department of Economic and Community Development. Under Commissioner Kisber's leadership, more than 50 corporate headquarters located in Tennessee, including Nissan North America and ServiceMaster. As a result of his accomplishments, the Tennessee Economic Development Council named Mr. Kisber the Fred H. Harris Economic Development Professional of the Year 2009. Prior to joining the Bredesen cabinet, Kisber served 10 consecutive terms in the Tennessee House of Representatives and has also been the Vice President of Business Development for First Tennessee Bank. He received his bachelor's degree right here at Vanderbilt University. James Parcell is currently the Energy Services Engineering Manager for Nashville Electric Services. The group is responsible for customer service for approximately 7,000 large industrial and commercial customers, all energy efficiency and demand response programs, renewable energy installations, power quality and technical support for large C&I customers, as well as private rental lighting. Previously, Mr. Parcell was NES's Program Implementation Manager for over 22 years, where he developed and implemented customer and energy services programs for all customer segments. He received his bachelor's in Environmental Science and Technology from Middle Tennessee State University. And finally, Dr. Stephen A. Smith has spent 28 years addressing important solutions impacting the modern environmental movement. He has served as Executive Director of Southern Alliance for Clean Energy since 1993, working at the forefront of climate change issues to encourage healthy energy options while supporting higher standards for environmental stewardship at the state and federal level. Previously, Dr. Smith served as Chair for the U.S. Climate Action Board of Directors. He's been a member of the South Carolina Climate, Energy, and Commerce Advisory Committee, as well as the Tennessee Valley Authority's Integrated Resource Planning Advisory Group. Served for 2 terms on the TVA's Regional Resource Stewardship Council, and he has been on the advisory board for the Alliance for Climate Protection. Dr. Smith received a doctorate in veterinary medicine from the University of Tennessee, as well as a Bachelor of Science in Biology from Kentucky Wesleyan. I'd like to thank everyone again sincerely for joining us this afternoon, and with that, I'd like to hand it over to Professor Eisen.
Good afternoon. I am deeply honored and humbled to be before you, having been chosen to be part of this LPAR annual issue. I never imagined when I first started out on this project to talk about residential solar that I would be standing here before you today. There are many people I'd like to thank. Claire, Kaki, and Matt of the review, thank you so much. Thank you for editing the article from its original length down to roughly 1/4 of its original length, and doing so in a magnificent fashion. It reads wonderfully. I commend the shorter version to all of you. Thanks to Mike and Linda for conversation. There is so much going on energy issues here on this campus, including, I've been told, another symposium taking part today across campus, and there's another energy law symposium tomorrow. There is so much dynamism going on here from multiple different disciplines, people trying to address energy issues in a coherent, comprehensive way. I've also met all of the panelists here, and I cannot tell you what a pleasure it is to be in the company of people who have spent many years, far longer than I have, trying to address energy and electricity and climate change issues. I want to talk very briefly about what this project was, but really what I want to do is have a conversation, and I want all of you to see the variety of different approaches that are out there now toward making renewables at the residential level, but also at the utility level, and Matt and Reagan will, the utility scale level, Matt and Reagan will talk about that, a reality. This has been a very long journey. Many of us remember, many of us of a certain age, remember that we've been talking about renewable energy since really the 1970s. And I know there are folks here today who have been in the installation business for many years. This has been, the needle hasn't moved much. We don't have a lot of residential installations, though I know Mike and Steve have installs on their houses. So I set about to answer a very simple question. And it is captured in the quote that's on this first slide here. And that is, why is it that we don't have more people who have solar on their house? And the conclusion that I've come to is that someone has to do what we've done for this. Make it simple enough, easy enough, that the barriers to putting it on your house are reduced essentially to zero. Now, one thing we do know about the technology of solar is that it's getting more cost competitive all the time. Modules are dropping in price. We're getting very close to solar parity. This is not a technology problem. This is not a problem of coming up with the next gee whiz solar technology. The technology, my friends, is already here. But if you look at the literature, as I have, about technology and innovation, you see that we are sometimes at the beginning of this very familiar S-curve, where only really the early adopters. Steve has a, 7.1 kW system on his house?
Right.
Okay. That makes him an early adopter. Mike has a 2 kW system. That makes him an early adopter. Everyone else, far down the curve, a late adopter. The question is, how do we get people to take up an innovation when that innovation is ready? Okay? We didn't always have cell phones. If you remember the bag cell phones and the early cell phones, we didn't always have them. We do now. So the question is, can this happen? Can this be a technology that is disruptive? Okay? And in a previous article, I've talked about whether solar meets the criteria for this. Could it be like cell phones? Could it be like fax machines? Once we thought we couldn't live without a fax machine. I don't know about you, I haven't used one for years. So here's where I began this project with the automobile. What I meant by this is, let's assume that everybody has something called a personal mobility vehicle. I made up this concept. It doesn't exist. You know it doesn't exist. Everyone has one, and what you're trying to do is sell cars instead. Every solar install is a custom proposition. My brother in New Jersey is going through this right now. He called me up after 3 months of going through this install and said, I'm frustrated. And I said, I'm not surprised. I know how this works. Okay? Given all the advantages of the system we already have that provides energy, we flip a switch and the electricity comes on. I ask my students all the time, what was your electricity bill last month? They don't know. They have no idea. How much did your electricity cost in cents per kilowatt hour? They have no idea. But they can tell me the cost of a gallon of gasoline right down to the penny. Okay? Given the entrenched advantages of the current system, why would anyone go through this? The answer is, by and large, they don't, unless they're people like us who see the inherent advantages of having a zero-energy house. Utilities have all the advantages of this personal mobility vehicle system. They have subsidies that give them incentives to deploy power plants. Professor Vanderbilt has great work about demand reduction, the extent to which we can get people to cut back on the amount of electricity they use. Right now, most utilities don't have a financial incentive to do this. Their incentive is to sell you more power. Okay? There are progressive utilities out there that are working on energy efficiency, and renewables. And I would love for Jim to talk some about what NES is doing in that regard. But by and large, the system is tilted in a direction away from this. Okay? So what I did, I was a sneaky law professor. I had 2 of my research assistants call solar installers in 6 different cities, chosen carefully for geographic balance and for other characteristics. For those of you who know about the electricity system, some of them were in restructured states, some of them were not, bigger states, smaller states, and so forth. I also picked states like California that have more incentives for solar, states like Tennessee that don't have quite so many. Okay? And the answers are surprising. It's not easy. The system is expensive. Even with the greatest possible combination of financial incentives, the lowest cost quote that any of my 2 students got was $10,000 for the average sized house. Okay? That is going to be a significant financial deterrent to most people when the alternative is to flip a switch and have the lights go on. Okay? And there are a couple of slides more about the high upfront cost of solar and what it takes to actually build the system. We talked a little bit before we walked in here about the frustration, the difficulties of the permitting, of just getting a system done. Okay? The solution is simple. Like the cell phone, have it be something that comes to you at little or no upfront cost. Well, okay, that's all well and good, but somebody's got to do that. Let's think about who that somebody's going to be. The second problem is the one that leads to that source of frustration. You have to deal with many different challenges. Who do I go to? Are they reliable? Are they the kind of person who's been in this business for a long time? How will I pay for it? If I'm the average consumer, I've walked away from this transaction long before I answer any of these questions. The solution is obvious. Make it a single process that's transparent to you. Someone else handles that. Someone else handles that. If you're going to install your own system, you might have to deal. I live in a neighborhood that has homeowners association. You might have to deal with going to that committee and finding out whether neighborhood covenants prevent you from installing your system. You might have to go to a local governmental authority to get the system permitted, and you're going to be dealing with your solar installer. The solution to this seems readily apparent to me. Somebody else does that. Somebody else makes that a matter of routine. Somebody else who might have deeper financial and legal expertise than the ordinary consumer takes on that responsibility. The fourth is that there really is no economy of scale in this business right now. You're dealing with small installers. I'm very friendly with a local installer in Richmond, Virginia, where I live. He installed 5 residential systems last year. This experience writ large is where we are right now. Okay? So then I looked in the article, and I'll skip through this quickly because we can talk about this in the discussion if you'd like, about whether existing incentives that we have out there move us down the curve. And we can talk about the regulatory instruments like property tax financing, power purchase agreements, and so forth. By and large, I've concluded that they don't, and in part because the only thing that they really change is the monetary incentive for the consumer, and even that they do relatively imperfectly. Okay? And again, I'll skip through this. We can talk about this some more in the discussion if you like. So the proposal that I've had, and again, you want to think about this more in terms of it being a thought experiment, something that may not happen tomorrow, it may not happen for 20 years, is the idea of something called a solar utility, where one company takes on all these responsibilities, and like the power purchase agreement that's available right now for larger solar installs, essentially is a residential PPA, a residential power purchase agreement. Yeah? We've done this before. We have actually chartered people to go into business. The government has done this. We've chartered people to do this. Here, by the way, is something that I'm familiar with because I ran into it in private law practice, and that is the licenses that were given out to the companies that started in the cell phone business in the early 1980s. Okay? It started out, the cell phone business started out with service territories that were given to cell phone companies that had the exclusive right, like utilities, to operate in those particular territories. Now, I know what you're going to say to me. We have utilities already. So one of the things you have to confront is whether the utilities themselves would take on this responsibility. That's a conversation worth having. I conclude by and large from the literature on technology and innovation that the utilities are not willing to take on all of the responsibilities that I've just described in a new business model of this sort. Okay? You should note, and you're going to hear from Jim and you will hear from others, that there are utilities that have installed plenty of solar. Don't get me wrong here. This is not a monolithic solution here where my solution has to prevail at the expense of what utilities are doing. I applaud the utilities like NES and others that are trying to put solar out there in the field. All I'm talking about in the article is that in terms of a more widespread deployment, we need a different model, and this is the model that I proposed. Okay? Money is obviously going to be important. And like a PPA, it would come today in a stream of different revenue streams. Okay, the technical elements of this we can talk about if you like, but basically the way this would happen is you'd pay for the electricity, you wouldn't own the system. This utility, solar utility, would own the system, would be responsible for maintaining it. So you have interesting little issues like dealing with state law of whether they would have an easement to come onto your roof and maintain the system. Some interesting little thorny questions like this. The biggest state law question that might actually impact on this is that once you're paying a company for electricity that's provided by a system that they own, they become utilities and have to be regulated as utilities under that state's law. So that's an interesting little aspect of this that I just basically left to the side in the article. I want to introduce you to something else that I'm going to be doing in the next couple of months, and that is writing about the smart grid. And I say this only because the smart grid might be the model, and companies that get involved with the smart grid might be the model for doing this. It might not be some freestanding solar utility as I propose in the article. Again, what I want you to see from the others who are going to speak is that this is not necessarily a freestanding solution that anyone will pick up and implement tomorrow in federal law. Instead, it is a means, a vehicle for thinking about a bigger policy question that is fundamentally very different from the mandates and incentives that we've used to try to push the technology at residential consumers. Okay? There are all kinds of assumptions here that have to be tested. That picture in the upper left-hand corner is from my actual experience buying a house in Richmond, Virginia in 1993, when my real estate agent told me that the hot water heater system, the solar hot water heater systems that were installed there, I would not want. You wouldn't want those houses. Okay? So there's a lot of caution here, a lot of what we have to get to. But many questions need to be answered about that. I've posed those questions in the article, again, for people to think about. Okay. With that, let's get to the other panelists and have a conversation. I think the conversation should show you that there are a lot of people who are interested in this and a lot of people who are interested in moving forward. Thank you.
That was a terrific presentation. And I just want to note that his PowerPoints are posted on the LPAR website for both Vanderbilt and Environmental Law Institute if you want to go through his PowerPoints at more leisure. Reagan, do you want to?
Matt is going to.
Matt, okay. Matt?
You want us to stand or?
Whatever you are comfortable with. We don't have mics. Yes, you do.
Yeah, I'll just, for ease, not to upset everyone up here, just sit here. And first, let me say what an honor it is to be part of this panel and to be with Professor Eisen and to talk about a subject that is very near and dear to my heart, both personally and professionally. I come to it with 28 years of public service background, having served in our state legislature and then in the cabinet of our former governor, and I guess 14 months now of being in the business, partners with Reagan Farr in trying to develop and deploy solar at large scale, both in host environments as well as in facilities that our company owns outright. I want to commend the professor for bringing a number of issues to the forefront for discussion, because I first got to know Mike Vandenberg when we served as fellow members of Governor Bredesen's task force on energy efficiency, because all policy, in my opinion, starts with leadership. And you've got to have leadership at the top that wants to make change happen so that you can have the discussion take place and you can have the outcomes occur that support the kind of policy decisions you're trying to create. Governor Bredesen felt very strongly about changing the discussion in Tennessee, having been a state that was the most inefficient with its use of electricity, to how do we become not only more efficient, but how does state government lead by example, and most importantly, how do you create these policies? And I remember very vividly the discussion that included architects and builders, and the fact that if we do not educate architects, who are probably the first point of interface with consumers in designing what they want in a house, then every other step down the road is going to become even more difficult. Builders who have to understand that it's not adding complexity and cost, but it's adding a service and a benefit to that homeowner is another step. Another policy consideration that we hear about more and more as solar becomes more prevalent around the United States is the threat, not just solar but renewables, the threat to the existing structure of the utility industry. In talking with those who are in the utility business, you know, there's years and years, decades of outstanding debt. There's a business model that's in place. Stockholders, bondholders, and others understand that. And when you start talking about distributed generation and the ability to put small power plants almost anywhere, it upsets a model that's been very successful in our country for a number of years, a number of decades. So there are a number of policy considerations from a public policy standpoint. And then there are also the real world obstacles that we confront being in the business. Understanding, you know, from a long-term, like any business, a long-term tax perspective. How is this industry going to be taxed? What is its regulatory structure look like? What are all these inefficiencies and ambiguities in the system for a new and emerging technology and a business? Quite honestly, in our business, and Reagan will talk more about this from the financial side, we've had to do a lot of educating. We've had to educate our host partners on what it is that we're trying to do and how it benefits them. We've had to educate lenders on how you lend money against these types of assets. We've had to educate insurers. Almost every step in the process, we've had to spend a great deal of time on the front end educating the service provider so that they understood the business opportunity and also the any risk or addressing any risk that they perceive. I'll bring all this together very quickly because I want to leave time for the others. In observing when we had the task force on energy efficiency, one of the it was during the time of President Obama's stimulus, the ARA program, and I managed the department that was responsible for the state's energy program. We received about $65 million in energy stimulus dollars. Governor Bredesen was very specific in saying to me, I don't want to do what a number of other states have done and send out light bulbs to homeowners and things like that. I want to do things that will move the needle, that will help citizens in the state understand the big picture and help to drive those policies. So half of those dollars were spent building a 5-megawatt solar farm that some of you might have seen on Interstate 40 in Haywood County on your way to Memphis. At the time, TVA, I think, had 300 kilowatts of solar in the valley, and we were proposing a 5-megawatt solar farm. Governor Bredesen had to personally negotiate the power purchase arrangement with Tom Kilgore, the CEO of TVA. That is how difficult it was, in that there wasn't a template by which to operate from. We had to work with the Department of Energy in understanding how this was going to fit within the context of the rules that they had created for the program. We had to work with the local utility in getting the appropriate type of transmission, and how would it be managed being out in the middle of a very rural area, a 5-megawatt solar facility, and what it did to the transmission load. It took probably twice as long with the governor backing it and trying to get it done than it ought to have taken in a place where the policies would already be there to accomplish this kind of outcome. And I use that as an example of, even with those who are perceived to have the most power within a state, the policies to accomplish these kind of goals are still very challenging, and there's a lot of work to be done. But I have hope, and I have hope because I think back not just to the cell phone industry, but I think back to cable television. And I remember as a child when it first started coming into some communities. Think about it, and the industry went and got policies in place that allowed the deployment to accelerate, and we don't care today as much about how we get the programming, because there's so many different ways to get it, as we do that we want to receive it and we know we want it to be there when we turn it on. And I think someday, with the right policies in place and the right leadership, we'll get to a point where renewables, including solar, will be in a similar position. Oh, I'll let you.
No, go ahead, Ray.
Okay, thank you. Want to compliment the program. I thought you did a wonderful job, and I think the concept is extremely interesting. The background that I bring to the solar space really is I am not a solar expert, not a solar engineer. My background is legal and finance, and solar is an interesting investment portfolio because you know on the front end what your investment is going to look like. And if you set solar up in a geography where the regulations are in place that you know what the output is going to be for an extended period of time, you basically know what your return looks like on a plus or minus basis for the entire investment. So I think one of the huge goals that we need in the solar space and as a country we need to try to figure out is how do we put a regulatory framework in place that has some level of continuity and stability. Even down at the utility scale, since Silicon Ranch has been an operating business for a little over a year, 14 months, the solar feed-in tariff program administered by the Tennessee Valley Authority has been changed 3 times in 14 months. So it is very difficult to decide how to deploy scarce resources, capital, in an environment where there is absolutely no consistency year over year, in some cases not even month over month. And because of that, I think when people look at putting capital into solar, unless you are a true non-economically driven investor, and that's the early adopters. Everybody there, nobody is doing solar today, or very few people looking at it purely from an economic standpoint. They're driven by something else. In order to get solar to scale, you have got to make it an economical decision and an easy decision. You have to remove barriers to deploying that capital. So right now there's a huge, people demand a risk-adjusted ROI on their solar investment. And solar, unless you are in areas where they have very aggressive feed-in tariffs, doesn't provide a really good risk-adjusted rate of return on your capital. And because of that, solar deployment has been limited, and it tends to go in huge spurts. You can look globally. When a country like Spain puts a very aggressive feed-in tariff, national feed-in tariff in place, solar and capital that supports solar from around the world focuses solely in Spain. You instantly oversubscribe the program and you throw it into complete disarray. And now you've gone from Spain being where the majority of the panels were deployed for a period of time to there's nothing going on in Spain right now. And you drive a lot of shoddy investment and poor workmanship because everybody's chasing a quick return knowing if I don't get this thing in the ground before this program shuts down, I'm not going to be able to participate in these tariffs. So I commend any program that takes cost out. One thing that we look at, in fact, Silicon Ranch's business model is really to be an independent power producer. It is very difficult to make it work in today's construct at a residential scale, but our goal is to do it at an industrial scale. And we face the very same challenges of deploying large-scale solar investments in conjunction with strategic partners. And in this space, when you've seen one deal, you've seen one. You basically have to recreate and renegotiate the deal every time you sit down at the table to do that. And until you have a more standardized process for deploying this, it's going to be very challenging from an economic perspective. And it is interesting because I always thought, the investment, I guess I selfishly think of the investment on my side of the table, but one of the companies and entities that we deal with is the local distributor. And Jim can tell you a little bit about the challenges and the investments that the current system has on a utility perspective.
Okay, thank you. Excuse me. First of all, thank you for inviting me, and the article is just so intriguing. Can you hear me okay? Am I turned on? And I've had the opportunity the last few days through a TVA Energy Efficiency Forum. Am I not? It does show turned on. Maybe I'm moving it a little closer. How about this? Okay. And TVA has had a great event the last 2 days, or the previous days, the Energy Efficiency Forum at the Gaylord Opryland, and I had a chance to talk to several people about this idea. But what I'm going to give you some statistics, some information about where we are and what we have with solar. And then I'm the utility guy, so I'm going to talk about the barriers to this idea. But I do want to close on a positive of some good things that are happening in renewables. But first of all, in this area, the relationship, Nashville Electric Service is one of 155 TVA distributors. We have to buy all of our power for them. We can't generate power. So TVA is our sole source, power provider, and regulator. We have 360,000 customers, 320,000 residential, 33,000 small commercial, and 7,000 large commercial customers, to kind of give you an idea. And load-wise, TVA's load on a hot summer day is 33,000 megawatts, and Nashville's is 2,700 megawatts. And I give you those numbers to put this in perspective on where we are today with our solar installations. In Nashville, we have 2 megawatts installed. We have another 400 megawatts, 2 megawatts installed, another 4 in process related to some of those changes that Reagan mentioned. And valley-wide, there's about 130, which is a long way from where we were. But think about that, a 33,000 megawatt load, and yet just 130 coming from solar. The Generation Partners program that we have, it's you install solar panels and we'll buy back the power for 12 cents above the current rate for 10 years. Pretty good financial model. That's getting ready to change in April to the program Generation Partners is changing from a pilot since 2005. That's a long pilot. Finally, in April, we're going to a fully deployed program known as Green Power Providers. And instead of a 10-year contract, it'll be a 20-year contract. So it could be more financially feasible for projects. But there will be a cap. TVA has placed a cap on this, which is one of the reasons we've had to change the program so much, is because people subscribe to too much. So that's the numbers. Now, to live up to the utility being negative, we do have a perception that utilities do not want solar, and I can kind of attest to that to some extent. And as I talk to people, I'm going to list some of the barriers that we've talked about. The first one is safety. A cell phone, the only safety reason there may be the electromagnetics or whatever, but every solar system has the opportunity to electrocute one of our linemen. So like if we had a tornado come through one day, the next day, if that house is not connected on a hot solar day, there could be some backfeed issues. So we take safety important to us. So that was the number one barrier that I kept hearing from. Second was sites, and I think we brought this up to some extent, but many homes have a lot of trees. We all like our trees. You always have a good solar site if you have large, tall trees, and the way it's oriented, that's important. So not every single house would be conducive to a good solar system. Labor intensive, you mentioned that a second ago. I mentioned 320,000 customers. It takes us over 100 hours of NES time for each installation, each solar installation. So imagine on a wide scale, unless we change something, that would not be practical. We had hoped that we could fast track, the installations and make them all the same, but we've been doing this since 2005, and each one of them has been customized. We've not found a really easy way to connect people quickly. And again, the 100 hours, part of that's contracts, but a lot of it is engineering studies, and labeling, and things like that. So another reason, another negative, well, I don't call this one a negative. I'm going to back up. TVA has changed. It has a focus that they just announced the last 2 days, really focused on energy efficiency. TVA is telling us as distributors that the least expensive resource right now is energy efficiency. Instead of building a nuclear power plant or buying more power on the market, getting our buildings right. So TVA in this area seems to be focused, and I'm glad to hear that, on energy efficiency right now. So solar may be taking somewhat of a back seat because of that. Not to say that's the right thing, but that's what I'm seeing out in the market. And Tennessee energy usage. I did want to mention that we're still #1 in the whole United States of electricity usage, over 1,300 kilowatt hours a month. That's why we really need to go after energy efficiency. Now the positive, that's enough on the negative side. The positive is that utilities are beginning to recognize that we need to be in the solar business. We're very customer service oriented. Some of the most difficult customer issues I've been faced with in the last few years were related to solar, because we were not able to meet their needs. And we're public power, customer service is important to us, and if a customer wants to install solar panels, we need to be able to do that for them. The next one, and I'm really excited about this, the DOE Sunshine Initiative, the Rooftop Challenge. What we've talked about is the price of the solar systems, the equipment is okay. A good deal of the price of a solar installation is the process of dealing with us, the permitting, the codes people, getting it commissioned. So we applied for a grant, we meaning Knoxville, Memphis, Franklin, and Nashville, right? I named them. We're working together through the DOE to streamline that process. And our first meeting is actually later this week, and over the next year our goal is to reduce this amount of time down to here while the solar panels hopefully keep going down in price, and we'll get to grid parity where it's the same price to generate from solar than it is from coal or nuclear. So the good news is that we're listening. The utilities are listening. We're working together. That's 4 of TVA's biggest utilities that are committed to try to make this better. So going forward, one thing that just an idea that we thought of, that we tossed around the Electric Power Research Institute. This might be an idea worth talking to them and getting some funding for a study, finding a utility in the valley or somewhere that would be willing to pilot this or study it in a lot more detail. That's what we did with electric vehicles. And now we have a plant here close by. We have over 300 electric vehicles connected in our service area. And a lot of it started with an EPRI study.
Great. We'll go ahead and start with Dr. Smith. If you need to go to class, that's fine. Just, leave when you need to. I'm sure it won't bother you. And then when you are finished, we will take a very brief break, and we have cookies and coffee, and we're going to give Professor Eisen a chance to respond to what he has heard.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to stand up because I like to rant and rave. This is something I do feel pretty passionate about. Again, my name is Stephen Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. We're a regional nonprofit organization that does energy policy and environmental advocacy in 5 southeastern states: Tennessee, North and South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. And we work on 5 program areas. We work on climate policy, we work on energy efficiency, clean power, which is in essence renewable electricity, clean fuels, which includes biofuels, electrification, and clean diesel. And then we also work on what we call high-risk energy choices,
look at coal-fired power plants, nuclear power plants, and offshore drilling. And so our organization has been actively involved in this space for a long time, and we've seen some very positive developments. But the fundamental problem, and is what Professor Eisen gets at, is that solar is not being deployed on scale. It's still largely a bit of a niche, boutique kind of technology. Now let me tell you, personally, I know it works. Since February of 2009, I've had a 7 kW system on my house in Knoxville. It absolutely works. There is, you know, you've seen that commercial about priceless. When you watch your meter run backwards in the day, that is priceless. That is an empowering experience for you to see. Not so much that you know that you're making money when it's running backwards. Some people, that may be their motivation. But for me, it's to know that I'm pushing electrons on the grid and I'm not taking electrons from a coal-fired power plant that is polluting the air that my child has to breathe, is creating global warming gases that are disrupting the climate and blowing the tops off mountains in West Virginia or East Tennessee or whatever through mountaintop removal. If you understand the cradle-to-grave environmental footprint of the energy sector, when that meter runs backwards, that is a priceless moment because you feel good about what you're doing and you know that you're part of the solution now instead of part of the problem. And so that's something that we all need to make available to everybody. I'm an early adopter, I get that, but it is something that we can do. But I would agree with Professor Eisen's point that there is a fundamental impediment to getting this technology deployed. And I would say at this day and age, we are quite literally at a fork in the road. Because over the last 100 years or so, we've built a very efficient, in the sense of delivering power to people. Electrification is ubiquitous now. We take it for granted. You go somewhere, you flip the lights on, it's there. In a lot of countries, that doesn't happen. But in our country, we're able to get the electricity to most every place that we want it in a relatively reliable, is probably the right word as opposed to efficient, because it isn't a very efficient system. But we're on the verge of change because the way that the structure has been set up, and if you look at how utilities are state-sponsored monopolies, a lot of them, there is some competition in some parts of the country, but in our part of the country, we're still vertically integrated monopolies that tend to dominate how electricity is delivered. And they have chosen what they thought was the right way to go. And in historic time, going backwards, that may have been the right way to go, but I would say that it doesn't work going forward long term. And what they've done is they've deployed low cost, largely based on fossil fuel. If I ask you where your power comes from today and you say, well, it comes from TVA, and you think, well, TVA has a lot of hydro plants, right? Well, wrong. Most of TVA's power still comes from coal. They're burning coal for the majority of the power. The next biggest resource for TVA is nuclear power. And some of us are less than enthusiastic about that, and you can go talk to the people in Japan about their enthusiasm for nuclear power as of what happened less than a year ago. And there are some real fundamental problems with that technology also. And then you get down to looking at things like gas and hydro. But going forward, these large central station plants, these large nuclear plants and coal plants, I don't believe are going to be the way that we're going to be generating power. We're going to be moving, and we already are, moving rapidly towards more modular, decentralized forms of power, more distributed generation, and solar potentially is going to be a major player in that as time goes forward. And I believe it's ultimately going to become a disruptive technology because the price points are continuing to decline. But one of the fundamental problems that we have right now is, and everybody focuses on the cost, but the reality is that there is a tremendous market failure in the way that we actually account for the power that we're receiving right now. We do not internalize all of the cost associated with a coal-fired power plant. You are not paying the full cost for what it takes to generate power from coal. And we're making some progress. We've recently passed some regulations that are forcing the utilities to continue to clean these plants up. But the majority of plants at TVA still do not have all of the advanced pollution controls that are necessary to reduce the emissions. And that's only focused on a small segment of emissions, primarily nitrogen oxides and sulfur dioxides. What is not being controlled, which is still a gross market failure, is we're spewing enormous amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that is disrupting our climate. You notice that today is in February. It's going to be 75 degrees here in Nashville. I had daffodils in Knoxville in January. I mean, it's bizarre the weather we're having,
Weather changes, but the climate trends are undeniable. And disrupting the climate is a fundamental market failure because we are not paying the cost now for the energy we're using that is leading to this. And because those costs are not being internalized, coal is cheap. Therefore, electricity is cheap. Therefore, solar is expensive. Well, that's wrong. It's a fundamental market breakdown that we've got to correct. And so until we do that, and the only way we're going to do that is to advance and grab more renewables and pull them into the marketplace and bring that on. Solar is going to be very important to do that. The other thing is that the utilities have the system tremendously gamed to their advantage. If you look at what happens with a vertically integrated utility, say what's going on in Georgia right now, there's a battle going on right now. Southern Company's bringing a $14 billion nuclear plant on at their Plant Vogtle plant, but at the same time, they've got their finger on a solar bill that is before the Georgia legislature as we speak that would allow third-party financing to go on to allow companies to come in and be able to offer some of the options that were outlined in this paper. Now, why is the utility doing that? Well, let me tell you, if you're a corporate executive or if you're a head of Southern Company, if you bring a $14 billion asset into your rate base and you get a guaranteed rate of return of close to 12% for the next 40 years, you're golden. I mean, your shareholders love you. And if you've now transferred all the risk onto the ratepayers because of early cost recovery and you're getting loan guarantees from the federal government to do it, why would you even think about solar? Your business model is enriching your shareholders. You have no interest in dealing with solar. Solar is kind of a pain in the butt to deal with because you can build a 1,000 megawatt unit and get this money. Now, I can't get 10 or 12% rate of return on my money right now. Can any of you? But if you're a utility executive, man, you're set. And that's the way the system's done. And that's why you're seeing this push to try to continue to put these large baseload plants and bring them in because it works because they've gamed the system. Their regulators are captive. They've got all this stuff set up to their advantage where they've socialized the risk and they've privatized the profits. That's what we're up against. And so until we confront the fundamental dynamics of how utilities do business, solar doesn't have a chance. Unless we come up with disruptive models that were outlined here about how we can maybe open it up in other ways. So this is actually what we need to do, and I'll stop now, encourage the conversation, but we're beating our head against this on a regular basis in multiple southern states because most of the southern states still don't allow this third-party financing in because the utilities do not want to let the camel's nose under the tent where you have an independent power producer coming in here and actually competing against their business model because they've got it gamed to their advantage. So I'll stop there and we can talk more about it.
All right, in about 2 minutes, there's going to be cookies back here. Claire, if you'll wave, they're going to be set up back there. But maybe we'll now move to Professor Eisen responding. And if you need to leave, do so. But I'm interested to hear what you have to say about what you've heard.
I was going to say, I think we're all going to stick around for a while. I'll stick around as long as anybody wants to. Students who have to go to class, thank you for coming, and thank you for listening to what all of the panelists had to say. I am, first of all, I'm tremendously encouraged by what I've heard. I think that one of the lessons that you really need to take away from this is a certain kind of paradox, and that is that while at one stretch we say that utilities need to change and that their fundamental business model does not encourage this sort of disruptive innovation, and Steve, I couldn't agree with you more about that. For the near-term future, we are dependent on them. And so that when you hear someone like Jim trying to work out the challenges of how solar installs would actually work, that is as encouraging a sign as you can possibly imagine. That is a conversation that did not happen 20 years ago. And it's a conversation that I hope happens more and more as a result of what I've written in the space. We talk a lot about the urgency of having to do this because of climate change, and that shouldn't be underestimated. But part of this is also a resiliency and spirit of innovation that we have as a society where we know with cable TV and cell phones and other models that we know we've brought this kind of change to the table. So I'm very encouraged by what I've heard here. I think you should be as well, but I think what I'd rather do is hear from you about your questions for everyone up here, and let us discuss, after we have some cookies, of course.
Yeah, yes, please just help yourself to cookies and coffee as we're having this discussion. Let me just give an opportunity, because some people had had a little bit shorter remarks. If anyone on the panel, Matt, I don't know if you have anything you want to add, or Reagan, or Jim. Okay. All right. Great. Well, let's open it up to questions then. Dodd?
I've always wondered about this. I'm a solar early adopter as well. And I was told that NES chose to adopt a Type 2 system as opposed to a Type 1 system, where power comes into the house before it goes to the grid. Is there any significance to the fact that NES did that? I'm wondering if that's a good thing that they chose to do all that.
Good question. When Generation Partners first started, it was option 2, which is kind of confusing. Option, when we changed it, is now option 1. That option 1, Dodd, gives us the ability to buy back all of the power without having billing issues. The option with the net meter on the line side, it creates manual billing issues and lots of mistakes, and that's primarily why we went with it. And actually, most power distributors are choosing that option number 1. And our demand customers that pay a demand on their electric bill, we don't give them a choice. All of those are option 1. Did I answer your question?
Can I respond? I think Jim's absolutely right. But for those of us who actually got in under option 2 and then had the choice to go either option 1 or option 2, I stayed at option 2 because, as I mentioned earlier, that meter running backwards is very subversive. And so I really do believe that being able to see that happen helps educate customers about what's going on. When you go to, as I understand it, when you go to option 1, you no longer get to witness the meter running backwards.
And it is true. It's a powerful thing. Because when they installed our system, actually Mike wasn't there, and I started looking at it, and it already started going backwards. And it's just incredibly powerful feeling.
It's an empowering feeling. And again, I get the billing challenges potentially about it. I actually believe they could be overcome, but it did take that visual away from the customers. But I still like to parade people back and let them experience it. It's important.
Let me. I want to add something in before the next question. I know you've been waiting. We'll hear from you in a second. That feeling of empowerment, we tend to think of that as a linear sort of thing. You see the meter moving backwards, and you feel great about the fact, and Steve captures this, as well as anyone, that it has that immediate payback and that immediate benefit from you. But it also is the kind of thing that can spur you to think in other ways about energy, so that you might become more interested than you already were in an energy efficiency program because you're already motivated by the fact that you're saving by virtue of having this system there. The analogy I like to use for this is the internet. When most of us first saw the internet, it had very limited purposes. I ask people when I talk about the smart grid, when they first encountered the internet, what they first used it for, and invariably all of us saw it in the early 90s for a very limited purpose. But that only hinted at what it could become. And this idea that you're empowered by virtue of having a system there can deliver far more benefits than that immediate payback that you get from the system doing its thing. And I just want everybody to think about that as we go along.
I had one thing. Our planning engineers at NES would be upset with me, I just realized, for that answer, because their main reasoning, Dodd, is planning. It's such a small scale now, it doesn't really affect things, but in the planning engineers' minds, a meter running backwards throws off their studies as to what circuit do we need to add a larger transformer or a substation itself. So in our planning engineers' minds, that's an issue. It shouldn't be, and we make you whole financially. But there is definitely a lot more opportunities for billing errors. Believe me,
You have a question in the back in the yellow?
Yes. So I want to thank all of you guys for coming. I think it's a really important topic. I'm really excited to hear about it. And especially Professor Eisen, I think focusing on the residential model, very relevant issue, especially in my home state of California, where the alternative would be large projects which tend to displace desert ecosystems. So I have a question about, especially in California, where we're already very generous about incentivizing solar, how we can make it easier on the individual homeowner to adopt solar. An anecdote about this, my brother is a solar power salesman. He worked for one company for a few years, and his deal installs 2 megawatts of solar. He moved to a new company in October and November that focuses on larger projects. He's already signed deals to install 11 megawatts. So how do you see there being a transformation that lets them play on 11 megawatts on residential?
First, let me comment on the first part of your statement, and that is this extraordinarily sensitive issue of renewable development on the public lands in California and the West. I'm quite aware of those issues. I've worked with a number of the people in Washington, in California, in other states who are trying to strike a balance, really, between the environmental goals of sensitive protection of the desert ecosystems and the development and deployment of renewable resources. This has resulted in a Department of the Interior effort on this earlier this year. Just wanted to point that out, that it's an extraordinary balance. A lot of people devoting a lot of attention to that right now. In terms of doing more than what California has already done, I fundamentally think that until one organization masters the types of issues, frankly, that Jim is talking about, that make solar a one-off proposition in many houses. And it's true that not every house would be suitable for solar. I know some in my own neighborhood that I know would not be because of their orientation or shading or so forth. But the fundamental aspect of this has not changed, and that is it's the experience with this becoming routine. And it is more that, and I've said this in the article, it's more that than providing an incentive or, frankly, having a renewable portfolio standard that mandates that renewables get done. That will be useful to utility scale projects like the ones that Silicon Ranch is doing. But even in California, I think that until we have widespread experience with this being something other than a niche product, and that takes a business model of somebody who's willing to scale it up the way Steve has described, I just don't think that even the most aggressive incentives in the nation that California has make residential installs any more prevalent than they really are today.
You have a question here?
You spoke about the infancy of several industries, such as the cell phone industry, the cable industry, and the utility industry, all of which basically started from a standpoint of monopolies, where each were granted licenses. You talk about moving in that type of pattern with this, yet 2 of the 3 are still monopolies: the utility industry and the cable industry. We have no choice. The only choice we have in any of those industries is the cell phone industry. Why should we follow that plan, since so far that looks to me to be a failure?
His cell phone is ringing. His cell phone is ringing. I'm not sure.
It's vibrating.
I'm not sure we'd consider the cell phone industry to be a failure. You do point. Look, you do point to something that's important here, and that's why I called it a solar utility and not a solar company or a solar distribution company. And that is, first of all, as I mentioned in the presentation under state law, this company would, in fact, be regulated the way that monopolistic utilities are today under most state laws. I've looked at most state laws about this, and it's typically is a creature of state law. I guess what I would say my easy answer there is that because the idea is unlikely to ever be implemented in practice, we may not cross that particular Rubicon. But the real answer to the question, I think, is that what we need to jumpstart an industry such as this is to do what we did for the cell phone company and quite literally create that sort of licensing, if you will, monopoly. If that is an issue in and of itself that precludes this sort of idea from being implemented, I guess what I would say is then you take the component parts of the idea, simply trying to make it more routine, and then you go to somebody like Jim or other utilities that have responsibilities for generation portfolios. I mean, that's really the big vertically integrated utilities are the ones you want to reach, and then reach them that way. I certainly understand the limitations of the idea in terms of creating that sort of monopoly. In fact, the law professor who called this a thought experiment did so for that precise reason. He said that alone would be probably the single largest barrier to implementing your idea. So I think if we went to EPRI to study this, they might say, that's a great idea, it's unlikely to be implemented in practice, but the concepts that you bring up in terms of minimizing the upfront cost, making this a more routine transaction are the kind of thing that need special attention if it's not necessarily done in that fashion. I'm sorry, that was a longer answer than that may have
Anyone else want to respond
deserved.
to that point? All right. Other questions?
I've got a question for the professor, and it's going to probably end up in Jim's lap as well. Smart grid, especially in Southern California and SDs, are very rapid. Don't you see a really pervasive effort by utilities of deploying smart grid aggressively to outpace what solar might be able to create as a consumer opportunity? I want to get your take on that. And also, Jim, I never hear a word about smart grid connectivity. And I know we live with cheap generation here, but does NES have any intent to look at residential demand response or using smart grid to do residential demand response?
Well, first of all, Jim's going to say the answer to that is yes. We were talking about that. I guess maybe you should cover that, and I'll come back and talk about smart grid more generally.
And thanks for bringing that up to give me the opportunity, because yes, I'm actually managing a portion of our smart grid project. We're just not talking a lot about it in public because of we've studied it a lot of how the communications are going nationwide, and it's created customer issues, so we're being very careful how we communicate our smart grid project. But right now next summer we plan to deliver, or this summer, 40 megawatts of voltage reduction to TVA. It should be transparent to you, but we're optimizing our voltage. TVA is paying us for that. I'm managing a direct load control piece. We're calling it NES Peak Saver, where you can have a cycling device installed on your air conditioner, commercial air conditioner, and through a two-way communication, we'll cycle it on and off during high peak demands, and we're delivering 10.25 megawatts the following summer to TVA. And then probably in about 18 months, we're going to start a 2 megawatt critical peak pricing project for residential. And if that works very well, that would lead to a widespread deployment throughout the service area.
Nothing about the units like on pool pumps, or I know that's
The CPP, the critical peak pricing, we would utilize Zigbee and pool pumps. That would be a part of it as well, communicating through Zigbee in the home to the different appliances. So we probably will not start that one until next calendar year, and we're going to be looking for 2,000 participants in Nashville to help us with that one.
Let me see if I can answer the question more generally. It's interesting that I sometimes feel like I've planted somebody in the audience to ask me about my most recent project. I am writing now about the interoperability standards for the smart grid. And that is quite literally the technical standards that make so much of what Jim has just talked about possible on a much broader scale. You mentioned Zigbee, which is worth talking about for those of you who have no idea what that is. It is a radio protocol that allows for communication between a smart meter and smart devices in the house. You could have a smart washing machine that responds to the price of electricity, or a smart pool pump or smart air conditioning unit. All of this is years away. But to answer your precise question, one of the ways in which the smart grid and solar tie in together is that some of the standards work is actually aimed at standardizing the interface for a residential solar owner and the utility, to have a handoff there that is responsive to things like pricing programs and connection with the utility and so forth. And that eventually may drive much more deployment of solar than even the model that I have at work in this article. I don't mean to undercut my own work, but that is that is definitely something that is coming down the pike, and I think it's very exciting stuff. And when I hear a utility like NES that is going into 10% of its service territory, that's a lot. They're going into 10% of their service territory with smart meters and with different experiments with that. I mean, I think that's just absolutely terrific. And I couldn't encourage it more.
The other thing that TVA and the distributors are experimenting with, but we need to accelerate here, is the real-time pricing, because you've got to send the market signal, and smart grid doesn't matter if you don't ultimately end up making smart consumers. You've got to have those two things connected, and you've got to give consumers the feedback so that they understand, because the empowerment we were talking about with solar, and when you're thinking about deploying efficiency before you deploy renewables, there's just a tremendous education, because people have just taken this so much for granted because it's ubiquitous. So if TVA and the power distributors, and they're getting seasonal rates, but if they go ahead and accelerate to where we're doing more time of use rates, then if they would give the value of solar the proper monetary value that it needs on peak, and also give solar the ancillary values that it has from taking pressure off the things like the substations and other things like that's going to help tremendously in this, because it's going to help the economics. And then it also opens up the whole thing with the electric vehicles, because if we start to see a greater penetration of electric vehicles, if you really had a smart system, you would be able to arbitrage with your battery in your car, where you could actually be selling. You could say, look, I only need X amount of power out of my battery in my car to get home, and I've got more. The utility needs some on this on peak, and you charge up at night or whenever, and you can then basically sell it, and you can begin to have this sort of communication going on between your car and into the grid, and then your solar system feeding the car and all this other kind of stuff. It opens up a tremendous amount of possibilities, and that kind of innovation and thinking is not widely understood or even being discussed at this part of our country at the level we need it to be.
I mean, and I want to add something to that. That's terrific. I want to add something to that. Notice that Jim's first comment on a concern that the utilities have, and it's an extremely legitimate one, is safety. Okay? And there are so many utility systems today that are many years behind the times in understanding sort of the dynamic conditions of what's going on the grid, so that something like what Steve is describing, I mean, you could generate power off your solar panel during the day when the sun shines, store it in a battery, and give it back to NES. Something like that is years away from many utilities, because their technical systems don't have the capacity to do this. And again, my underlying work here is on literally the technical standards to standardize that and make that all possible.
I just recently read an article which discussed the problem of utility when you reduce demand, and that is your costs are fixed, and NES's costs are fixed, TVA costs are fixed. We start feeding this back, basic rate has to go up on utility. And that's an issue that I think the regulatory agencies have not dealt with.
I think we can all address
I think we can all address this because we were talking about this before we walked in. I will comment that I think everyone should address this because it's an important issue. And I would also say that Professor Vandenberg's done some of the nation's best work on trying to figure out how to put utilities in the position where that is not so. Okay, but I think everyone else here would have intriguing perspectives on this. It basically entails putting utilities in a position where they are not simply being paid for kilowatt hours that they generate or, in the case of NES, sell. I think that's you ought to hear from them in terms of what that would entail.
The infrastructure, the physical facility, and the manpower that they have to do it either way. And you feed it back and the rate has to go up.
Well, in our case, we're a wholesaler. And so we talked about this earlier in Austin Energy. They've done a lot of good work with energy efficiency and demand response, but they generate as well. And so they have a more vested interest, whereas with NES, we really have to partner with TVA to help them. And I'll use the example, I mentioned the 33,000 megawatt load. Well, I bet a lot of you do not realize that TVA cannot meet the needs of the valley during those hot summer days. So they have to buy power from elsewhere, and that shows up on your bill in the fuel cost adjustment. And so that's how they're dealing with it right now. They would really love to get the load down below the 33,000 megawatts, but it's just not happening at this moment.
Well, I probably have a little different perspective on that.
That's why I looked at you.
TVA is making decisions as we speak about how to bring on additional generation assets, okay? And the fundamental problem is that unless they value efficiency as a resource and plan for it, then they set up the dynamics that you identify. But there are assets that need to be retired because they are inefficient. And as those assets are retired, and if you actually build efficiency into the system and some of these other things that we've been talking about, you will fundamentally get at the stranded asset proposition that you're talking about. But the problem is that most utilities have built their business model and their framework about, a mindset about pushing electrons to a meter and maintaining a high degree of reliability and making sure that they have the sales that continue to see growth. It's sort of like asking McDonald's not to sell hamburgers. As a matter of fact, Tom Kilgore actually said this. He was the CEO of TVA in Chattanooga one time. Initially, this is before he got religion on efficiency, but he was saying, asking us to do efficiency is like asking McDonald's not to sell hamburgers. But the reality is that energy efficiency is the lowest cost resource for meeting demand. And it is, to me, it's a fundamental premise that we ought to squeeze out every bit of work out of each kilowatt hour we do, because how we generated those kilowatt hours have profound impact on our generation and future generations. And so therefore, the utility should not view itself as some sort of a, and this is probably a little harsh, but just for the fun of saying it, some sort of pusher, like drugs, through a meter that you have to take these electrons. They should be viewing themselves as a service provider. And so when you get up in the morning and you flip on your television or your coffee dryer, run your hair dryer, you're not sitting there thinking, now how many electrons can I pull through my meter at this point? You want that service to be provided to you in a reliable way. If it can be done in an extremely energy efficient way, you don't care. Matter of fact, it actually is to your advantage because you keep more dollars in your pocket. If the utility could be made agnostic about the throughput of the electrons, then, and they're looking at being a service provider of electrical services as opposed to a pusher of electrons through a meter to maximize profit, then that is, that's the way we need to go. Now, NES and others are nonprofits because we're talking about public power in this region, but they have to meet certain, growth goals and dollar goals within their system, and we haven't figured out a good way to make them completely agnostic. And Jim's correct. It's got to be a combined relationship, sort of three-dimensional level of chess, because the consumer, we as consumers are part of that equation. The distributors as the retail providers are part of the equation, and then TVA is the generator. and getting that system in proper alignment where they value energy efficiency. We're just on the beginning edges of that. But if we do it right, what you're talking about will be a complete non-issue with proper planning, and that's what's missing right now.
Well, and I want to actually add one thing very specifically about TVA, because they are making decisions. They're deploying literally billions of dollars, putting a bet on a baseload nuclear reactor that they can't borrow money to build, so they're going to enter into a sale-leaseback transaction where whoever the purchaser who leases it back, so now there's two levels of built-in guaranteed profits. One, you're guaranteeing a profit to the purchaser of the nuclear plant who's going to turn around and lease it right back to TVA. So there are, when you start talking about, all of the solar dollars we talk about are just crumbs. I mean, they really are a rounding error. And all of the energy efficiency programs are rounding errors on TVA's total expenditure. But when you're playing with billions of dollars investing in nuclear plants, it's a real decision that needs, I would argue, a little bit more public discussion before it's moved forward.
Let me add before you go ahead. Yeah, sure.
20 years ago, I had a power plant and was generating electrical power for use inside of a facility. The local municipality came in and offered us 3 mil power to shut our plant down.
That's still happening. I mean, the utilities, the generators do not want, as by and large, do not want to encourage independent power producing because they, again, not in this case where you have a public power entity, but in the case where you have a regulated monopoly, they actually see advantage to getting that regulatory asset into their rate base because they get that guaranteed rate of return. And so the more they can do that, if you're doing cogeneration or you're doing independent power producer or whatever, like I said, they really don't want to encourage that.
Let's take one more question, and then I assume you all can hang out for a little while for additional questions informally.
Has any work been done with storage of electricity? I know of a system, I'm not from this area, but I know of a system where they're creating a lake with the extra energy that's coming in from wind power and then from the pole generation. And they're pumping water into this lake and set up.
It's got the largest one. Yeah.
We actually have Raccoon Mountain, or when I say we, TVA, it's in Chattanooga, where they did blast out the top of a mountain, put a lake up there, drilled a hole through the core of it, and they dropped down water, which turns a generator to create electricity. So they did that many, many years ago. They haven't really moved forward with it, but if you talk about a good field trip, the next time you're in Chattanooga, go to Raccoon Mountain and take that elevator through the core of the mountain down to the generators. It's really impressive. If you have not done that, I highly encourage you to do it.
And I'll talk about it on a different level, which is the residential level. Okay? I was at a presentation last year at a Future of Energy Law Symposium given by the head of the trade association of the major investor-owned electric utilities of this country. And these are major utilities that are responsible for these billions of dollars of planning decisions. And he stood up in front of an audience like this one and said, storage is a game changer. And what he meant by that was not so much the large utility storage, but it's you and me with batteries in our basement. Okay? And there are numerous people working on numerous different ways that this could possibly be done. The suggestion we had about vehicles arbitraging with the grid that Steve was talking about is being talked about today because that is really the first technology that we know of that's likely to be widespread for consumers where they have batteries. But when you and I have batteries and a reliable connection back to the grid, then all bets are off because we can generate our solar power during the day and store it and use it at night. And we can, if we so choose, communicate back to the grid with it. And that would fundamentally change everything we've talked about today, but it seems to me to be years away in terms of actual cost and so forth.
Can that be powerful enough to generate electricity for a house when the power is down?
Absolutely. Yes. Matter of fact, my Leaf is a 24 kW battery. So it's 24 kilowatt hours worth of power there and so on. your home, over the course of a whole day, depending on how efficient it is, could use anywhere between, 20, 30 kilowatt hours of electricity. And the Leaf is a small, it's a serious battery, but you look at BMW's coming out with, I think, a 36 kWh battery, and other things like that. So, you could draw out of your car enough to run your house if you have an efficient house. Now, if you've got a Hummer of a house that is really inefficient, then, maybe not. But that's what we need, that's what we were saying earlier. We need to be able to sort of look at our homes the same way we look at our cars, so you can sort of talk about it in those terms. But, the other thing about storage that's, when I was talking about the sort of paradigm within the utility mindset, if you are the guy at a load center where you are responsible for making sure that the amount of generation is up, because you got to understand that over the course of a day, the power starts low, it comes up, it peaks, and then it drops off. And so TVA has a huge swing in their system from where, at 2 in the morning, they may only need 10 or 12,000 megawatts, but then in a hot afternoon in July, they may need the 33,000 megawatts. So you can see that swing, and they'll dispatch according to the need as the load climbs. And they like to basically have things that when they flip a switch, they know it's going to be on. That's why they like to burn stuff, because they know it's there. Wind and solar and the renewables are intermittent, and they're not necessarily there exactly the way you want it. And so having some way, because the guys in the control room, this was told to me by one of the guys that actually worked in the control room, they kind of like to have their feet up on the desk and just sort of be watching it. Whereas when the wind's coming in or the solar's coming in, they're like, they got to be like on top of their game, because there may be some fluctuation. And so if you can, that's what Raccoon Mountain is so important, because when we were doing the 20-year plan for TVA, they're hungry for wanting to have another one of those things, because they can swing that thing instantaneously to respond to what's happening. And it potentially could help with renewables. It could also help them with their nuke plants, because if they have all this extra power at night, they pump that water up, and then at the day when they need it, they drop it back down, and that's very cost effective for them. So storage is a game changer on multiple levels, and it's one of those things, if we could figure that out, it would take one of the biggest impediments against renewables that the guys in the utility industry throw at us all the time. Well, it's intermittent, we can't count on it. We need to put steel in the ground that we can count on, that we know is there. Now, there's a lot of more that we could get into about why that's not even true, because they have enough flexibility on the system to manage a lot more renewables than they have. But their mindset is, we don't want this to grow because it's not dispatchable.
I had one more quick comment on this. I've lost my sense of direction in this building, but somewhere close by here is a solar-assisted charging station going in, and we're going to have another one in the Titans parking lot, and maybe one more in Nashville, where it's kind of like that. It's a canopy, a solar canopy, and it will charge cars, and there's batteries involved. It's kind of a convoluted project, and I won't go into a lot of detail. It's not really as it seems, but the idea of a solar-assisted charging station is a good one. It is going to be demoed within at least a couple of football fields from here. Again, I've lost my sense of direction.
I think we need to break. I'm sorry, it's 1:30, but I think you all are willing to stay a little bit longer, and we have more cookies and coffee. And before we thank you, I can't believe I'm saying this, but we have a Facebook page for this event. This is the benefit of working with students, and we would love your comments and feedback. Our next event for LPAR is April 13th on Capitol Hill in Washington, where we will do the same format with several other articles. We would love for all of you to join us. I assume that's not possible, but we will be posting the audio of that shortly thereafter on the website. So I also want to make sure to thank the students who did a